we tended to have social economies where everybody worked, everybody contributed, everybody had a job. Part of the reason that we did that was to, I don't want to say to maintain a hold over those resources, but it was to demonstrate that these resources are here, we have a way of managing them. If you want to look at it in terms of signaling to other communities, we're a very strong community and can exercise hunting and defense of this area, so you tend to not have as much overlap or incursion into other people's areas. Now, what happens if a big significant part of your population quits working? Well, if that happens, then you're probably not using some of those resources, and it can tend to lead to upheaval. Social systems, all of those roles that we have in our communities at this point are pretty well filled. We have a way of deciding who the next teachers are going to be. We have a way of deciding who the next duck chief is going to be, who the next person that specializes in gathering a particular bark for a particular kind of canoe. These are all jobs in the social economy that have kind of settled with individuals. Those individuals have this non-classroom based learning where you have these apprenticeships where that knowledge, that indigenous knowledge, is passed down in the communities. Things tend to be going pretty well. So this is our equilibrium. We're moving generally in this direction, and then something happens, this outside force comes through, and we're no longer moving. Now we've got some combination. If this is our inertia of how our indigenous systems are working, and this other thing hits us, well, we're going to get then some new direction. And I'm going to borrow some lay terms from physics here. This is our inertia, and things tend to move in this direction until they're acted on by another force. Here's our other force. We're going to call this colonial, or colonialism. And you'll see that some of these theories apply not just to First Nations and American Indians, but we tend to see the same kind of systemic patterns happening in other places of the world as well, particularly New Zealand, Australia, places in Africa. Some of these theories tend to go a long way towards describing the same kind of things that are happening.
Indigenous type of people?
You could probably say that there's some similar thing that has happened now. But so now, instead of our inertia going this way, we get this what's called a perturbation of this system. Perturbation means that there's some external thing that's happened, some external force, and we're no longer moving here, that there are these little bits and pieces of chaos happening. And what's going on, our social systems, our land use systems, our indigenous education, they all change at this point. We're going through this process of great change. We've talked a little bit about some of these ideas that came out of the Two Approaches paper, and we can start to see the relationship between colonialism and Native people. So we tend to now find social systems that are, we can't say that they're not functional, or there's not an equilibrium, or there's not an inertia, but we see that there's something different. Through different things, like in Canada, we had the Indian Act, we had things like boarding schools, and we have things like tribal councils. Or in Canada, we would call them band councils. So now we're starting to see that there are these new systemic things that are happening. Our education system is supplanted by boarding and residential schools, obviously very different than what we were used to having in our communities. The Indian Act and other subsequent acts and acts in the U.S. tended to try and replace the traditional forms of governance with these new councils. Band councils in Canada, they were called, and tribal councils in the States. In many cases, they just grabbed up groups of Indians and put them together and said, poof, now you have this tribal council and it will do what your old governance systems did. But we know that that didn't always work out well. In fact, in some cases it worked out quite poorly because they took warring groups that never got along, and put them together. And especially in the mid to late 1800s, they took groups of people that previously really didn't care much for one another and put them together in very close proximity. Groups that had been competing over certain areas of land, and they decided that, well, you're all going to get together, you're going to get along just great. Now we've given you this new great council, this new structure for getting things done, and so we just expect for things to happen wonderfully. As far as our land use systems, we also tended to then find that there were not just Indian agents, but particularly in Washington as well, we also started to find farm agents. And I always thought it was funny when you do interviews with elders and they talk about the Indian agents, they will inevitably start talking about the farm agent as well. One of the things that came out of the boarding school movement, particularly with the residential school system in Canada, is they weren't, when they say that they were there to educate First Nation populations, the kind of education that we're talking about was not like going on to graduate school and you were going to be this world leader in maybe policy analysis. They were primarily animal husbandry schools where they wanted you to be smart about growing better crops and raising better rabbits or cows in particular, sheep, goats, chickens. You would not find an animal husbandry school where you would be given a herd of elk and you would then set policies that would, even though you had these existing structures that maintained these elk herds since the beginning of time, now we were supposed to focus on, give up on that, don't worry about it. We know you've done a really good job for, I don't know how many thousands of years, and things have just happened this way, but now we would like to have you focus on dairy cattle or hogs or these other kinds of things. So we tend to see that the trajectories of all of these things are changed. And I'm going to do them kind of in different directions because there's this kind of chaos and we're finding different parts of these things, our social systems, the way we relate to ourselves, the way we relate to our own indigenous societies, the way we relate to even our own mothers, our fathers, our elders. Those things all change. And we start to come up with these new directions, these new inertias, where we now have a little bit of a mix. We've got a mix of some traditional native ideas, practices, beliefs, values. Some of these things continue to carry on, but we're also now getting we're getting things that look quite different. New laws, new structures, new money, new resources, new education. And over time, these things change. They change in various ways with different laws. But what we don't ever really find is this systemic rebuilding of our communities based on either these ideas for gathering experience and making decisions as adults, or incorporating that foundation back into our communities by teaching young people about some of these things. And so when we talk about changing this inertia or changing this direction, we can all see that if we look at, say, the first generation of people in this area, first generation, there are a lot of things that happen here. Those people become very traumatized when you take everything that's worked and you are told that there's a better way, there's a newer way, there's a way that works much better for you, but none of those systems seem to work out as positively as people are telling you. You tend to start to fight amongst one another. You tend to become mistrustful of new policies. You tend to not be very excited when somebody comes in with a new packet and says, here's a new set of policies and these are going to be really great. You tend to be a little bit skeptical of those things. You tend to have a lot of these internal arguments of, we should go back to the way that it was because we had these things that worked. We can see that we have this little bit of a shadow institution developing. There are these new formal, these are what we would now call our formal, sometimes they'll be called legitimate. We will also sometimes call these written. And when we find other things, when these kinds of things, some of them continue on and they manifest themselves, then we tend to find what are called informal or sometimes illegitimate or unwritten systems. And what some people call these are shadow institutions. And in our language, that would be, was it nishi, shadow. So they kind of mirror what's going on. They sometimes are very close. Sometimes formal and informal systems have the very same goals. Sometimes they're very different. Sometimes they use similar tactics. Sometimes they're very different.